sort of developed service economy country decide that it wants to go back to being an industrialized country, because most people don't want to live next to factories.
So I have a bit of a hot take here. I'm not actually sure that the tariffs are a bad thing. I think maybe the way they've been rolled out is going to be troublesome, but in a lot of ways, like if the policy intent is to reintroduce industrialization into the country, this might be one of the better ways to approach it.
Also, Apogee, I believe we can now just ban Moto.
Can I get a third?
So, to me, when you talk about them being good or bad, it's, it depends on what the effect that the administration wants to achieve is. I can't think of an effect they could want that would be best served by the way they're doing this. So to me, it's
If they're trying to bend people over a barrel and force them to the table to negotiate, this might work.
In those circumstances, for something like that, what I would expect them to do is pick specific countries, more like what we saw in the first Trump administration, or like what we saw with Canada and Mexico early on, where you go, okay, we are going to totally screw over your one country to force you into a good deal. When you do it with everyone like this, you put the people on the other side of that conversation in a much stronger position than they would otherwise be in.
I've always been a big fan of picking a reasonable amount of fights to fight all at once. Not fighting.
I mean, if it's everyone, it's technically just one fight.
Maybe. That's a hard battle to row.
I will note, clear signal on basing our budget on tariffs. There is like a weird East India Company vibe to the whole thing. Like this whole conversation would totally fit in like early to mid 1800s, like sort of towards the end of European countries with colonialism and protectionism with each other and industrialization. Fit great then.
I mean, my issue with that, basing the budget on tariffs, is what you're doing is you're betting against your policy working at that point. Because what you're saying is, oh, we're going to continue to import things because we can't possibly make these things here in the United States. So we're going to base our entire federal budget around these perpetual imports that are going to happen, which seems to be betting against their intent.
Well, and it's kind of like one of the examples I use is taxes on things like cigarettes going towards, say, state healthcare, where if you raise that tax high enough to where people quit smoking, then you have less money for healthcare. Or the thing with
one
using
of my favorites.
Or things like the gas tax and electric vehicles, where okay, if you make that too high, then you don't have any money to maintain roads with.
Okay, I can actually speak to both of those very authoritatively. So here we go. I will say I'm a huge fan of vice taxes funding public health, especially when it is tailored.
As someone from Las Vegas, go to hell.
Yep. Especially when it is tailored towards any sort of like funding the cessation campaign for those objects. So if most of the cigarette tax is going into funding cigarette cessation, I'm totally fine with that because those should kind of correlate with one
another. They should correlate. Yeah, the amount of money you need to spend on getting people to quit should be roughly related to how many people you want to get quit.
And then with gas tax in particular, really unpopular opinion, so we'll see how chat likes it. But we've kind of moved beyond. Gas tax made sense in an age where it was cheaper.
Everything used gas.
Technology. Well, and you could do it at the pump. You didn't have to do it on the individual vehicle. But everything these days is so connected and so networked, it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect a road use tax to be plausible these days.
So you're telling me that my 2003 Honda Accord needs to live forever.
I'm telling you that when it goes in for the yearly inspection, which you would need to implement in a state with a road use tax, they could record the odometer and send you the bill.
I move states every year. Got it.
Okay. But electric vehicles in the increase in fuel efficiency is putting a strain on transportation budgets as it's no longer covering what's needed to maintain the infrastructure.
Well, I mean, it's kind of, there are a lot of things where when you have that disconnect, it's, you don't, you ideally want your sort of taxing mechanism to be connected to how much you expect to spend on something.
Yes, I'm a huge proponent of making sure your budget and your revenue is in line with your policy goals and ensuring that they're not working against one another.
Well, I mean, I think that's, you know, going back to the tariffs, that's one of the big disconnects is there's not, you know, Trump doesn't have like a really strong ideology. You know, he's not someone where you can say, oh, okay, this is like the intellectual school of thought that's being followed here, and you can use that to kind of work around it. It's really how each of these things seem to strike him on an individual basis.
Well, and ultimately, he has to go back to Congress and get them to grant him the authority to generate revenue in this way. So what he's done is he's jumped the gun and said, this is the way we're going to do it. But Congress hasn't allocated what happens with those funds or how they're used yet.
Well, and you don't really have, one of the things we've seen with a lot of things with Trump is that if Congress elects to not do anything, it's a lot different. You know, there's a vast amount of authority in inaction. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing with the tariffs is, you know, Congress, if it felt politically inclined to do so, could come out tomorrow and say, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. And it just wouldn't happen at that point. But as long as Congress doesn't feel inclined to intervene that way, the president has a vast amount of authority to do all kinds of different things like this.
Yes, but he does not have the authority to spend all the revenue that's going to come in from tariffs yet.
I wonder, and I don't know it at all, but I do actually wonder what happens if, okay, Congress does nothing. And so now you have this revenue coming in from these tariffs. Where does it go?
I don't know how that works on the federal level. In a lot of states, it might go into a rainy day fund of some sort until they decide what to do with it, or it could
Right,
just be
figure
held
it
in
out.
another account. Yeah. But I don't, if the federal government does have a rainy day fund, it's useless given our debt.
So yeah, I mean, you do run into things where by Congress not acting, you do end up with a lot of things where you can't, you know, Trump can do things like institute the tariffs, but can't then spend the money in a way that might mitigate some of the negative effects of the tariffs. And so, you know, that's the other risk here is that you do this and, you know, say the tariffs are upheld, but there's not enough of a majority in Congress to actually use it on anything in particular. You can end up with what would normally mitigate some of the harm would either be, you know, the reduction in income taxes or increased federal spending where they use the money for something. You know, those things don't really happen until Congress decides to get involved. And once they decide to get involved, then they have to be kind of on the record about what they think about this.
Yeah, they
And
can't.
so I think that's something, that'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of months, you know, because theoretically you could bump enough federal spending to mitigate most of the, individual economic harm that the tariffs would cause.
With all of the messaging around reducing spending and reducing government waste, there's zero appetite to increase federal spending to create new departments. I think the only path forward here in a sticky situation is going to be to take it out of income tax.
Right. Well, I mean, and that from a economic mitigation perspective, that's in some ways the same thing, where, now taking it out of income tax will benefit people who pay income tax or a lot of income tax more than people who don't. So you do end up in a circumstance where, someone goes to Walmart and they buy a t-shirt for $5 and now their t-shirt's $7, and those $2 in tariffs go into the federal government and that reduces income tax. So then, that $2 is in effect being redistributed to the people who used to pay that income tax. And that's ideologically something I could see, Trump being okay with.
So, Tony, you point out a good point. In Project 2025, there is a mention of a sovereign wealth fund. I think if the tariffs were used to kickstart a sovereign wealth fund, and that sovereign wealth fund was used with the express intent of re-onshoring our manufacturing capability, that could be a position where the policy will work with the budget pretty nicely. But
to me,
I haven't
think,
actually seen any movement on that. Maybe they are, but I feel like I would have seen or heard some rumbling at this point if someone was planning on doing that.
also, I think you run into the problem of just the scale of the tariffs and the amount of money that you're talking about. There aren't sovereign wealth funds that work at the scale of the United States. That trying to place however many $1 trillion is incredibly labor intensive to do. And that kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier, where, a sovereign wealth fund works similarly to an institutional investor. And it's the same problem with something like, say, privatizing Social Security, where you have this huge pile of money that outweighs every other participant in the market.
Yeah. And it would outweigh pretty much every other participant. But yeah, they might go to use it on things. Yeah. I would need to read more into that. Oh, look, there is an executive order on sovereign wealth fund. Thank you very much, Arya. Came out in February. And they have to deliver a plan within 90 days. So when did this come out? February 3rd?
No, but we've declared that one day is the whole year, so it's fine.
That works on the legislative calendar, not necessarily for an executive branch calendar that is actually guided by true days.
Days from here forward will have 2 sunrises and 2 sunsets. They'll be the greatest days. The biggest
So this
days.
plan is owed to us in about 30 days. Really, 23 days, 27 days. So we should be hearing something about it here shortly. Cool. I'm a big fan of sovereign wealth funds, personally. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
And I mean, and to be fair, several states already have sovereign wealth funds.
Which state has a sovereign wealth fund? Virginia does
Alaska.
not.
Texas has 2, actually.
Interesting. And it's separate from the pension fund, state pension fund.
It is. So Texas has the permanent school fund and the permanent university fund. So the permanent school fund It funds public schools, so primary and secondary education. It also trying to think if it funds any state universities.
It does.
But the
So
permanent
those
university fund funds the UT system and the Texas A&M system. It
those
permanent fund doesn't fund any other state universities.
so some of those in the school fund, you also get things like community colleges and things like that. So in Texas, those two funds primarily exist to deal with oil and gas revenue off of state lands. So when you drill an oil and gas well, you lease the land and you pay, generally between about 5 and 25% of the revenue from the oil goes to the landowner. If the landowner is the state, then generally a state that has a large quantity of that, like Texas or Alaska, has those structures for that kind of thing. In Alaska, you have the state itself, mental health trust, SERI, organizations like that. In Texas, it's mostly the schools. There's also Scottish Rite Hospital, which does a bunch of community medical care stuff. But it tends to be resource extraction states that do that.
Interesting. We do have.
I think most state sovereign wealth funds are like oil and gas based, I want to say, or at least some sort of natural resource.
Yeah, they tend to be tied to those also because those revenues can be vastly larger than what your state might spend that year. So you need some structure to deal with, okay, we got $100 billion and we're going to spend 10 billion. What do we do with the last 90?
So, Imperial, is that the name? Yeah, or something like that. That is an interesting way to put it. I could definitely see the federal government possibly using something like a sovereign wealth fund to bully industry. But that really comes down to a question of how you would go about doing independence of something like that. I mean, we've all seen how independent institutions have gone so far, but the Fed has maintained a lot of its independence.
You need a committee.
That's a good thing to think on. I would hope the legislative branch in establishing a sovereign wealth fund makes it independent, like actually independent, like the Fed. That would be preferable, if not handing it to the Fed.
No, president has to individually sign each one.
That would
So
be.
And my headphones are now beeping, telling me that they're about to die.
So, mine have been doing that for a while too. They'll probably go through shortly. Well, it was fun.
It was. We should definitely do more of these. If you have any other questions, I'm usually sitting around in some room on here, or ask them in markets and finance, and we'll catch them, and then we'll see if we can organize something else like this again in the relatively near future.
Also, Apogee, before we all go, what is the intent for this new markets and finance role?
That is very open-ended. We will see. So I created it for us to have fun with it, and as something happens, we'll see what's up. Whether it's more of a news desk type role like we've used with some, or if it's like a channel role like with the space notifications or severe weather, stuff like that. But we
I
might
say we
try to
just
use
ping it at random. Everything
I mean,
has some financial impact.
there you go.
I can justify pinging that role with every message.
I could take a picture every morning of a gas station, gas prices at some station, and ping everybody with it, and see what happens.
I'll take a picture of the strip because it shows discretionary spending.
There you go.
All right, it's been fun. I'll talk to you guys later and hopefully get to do another one of these. And it was fun to get everyone's kind of feedback as we went instead of our usual mild echo chamber thing in EM voice chats.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining.